Gaikoku Gamers!
Bytesized.
Welcome to Gaikoku Gamers. I'm Darryl Benson. I'm here to talk to you guys today about an often forgotten platformer called Crash Bandicoot. Crash Bandicoot was kind of the unofficial mascot for PlayStation for some time. He kind of shared the spotlight with Spyro and Lara Croft, among others, but what was really special about this game was just how advanced it was at the time, and how much character it had. And I think this is something that not a lot of people know. I got a lot of information from Andy Gavin's blog, and I'll put a link to that into my description underneath, but I think people ought to read it. It's several pages long, actually more than several pages long, but it's a good read, and I think everyone should look into it. So they basically talked about how after making Way of the Warrior, that horrible fighting game on the 3DO, Naughty Dog went ahead and decided that they wanted to do another game, and while on a cross-country road trip from Boston to LA, they were thinking about what kind of game they could do. And the way that they chose this was to create a game that there weren't any other types of those type of games yet on that system. Basically fill a hole, which is what they did with Way of the Warrior. Whether or not you like Way of the Warrior, it doesn't really matter. What they did with that game, though, is at the time 3DO didn't have any fighting games, so they filled a hole. And one of the benefits that he talked about with that is that, despite the fact that many people obviously didn't like it, whenever other fighting games were brought up in magazines and the like on other systems, they would always compare it eventually to Way of the Warrior on 3DO, because that was what the 3DO had to offer. So it gave the game exposure, and that's really the name of the game. That's how you get sales. Even if it's a bad game, the more you can get people to think about it, the more likely you are to sell it. There's been plenty of bad games in the past that have sold well simply because they've been exposed a lot in the media. I can think of several just that just came out this year. Destiny. Anyway, they wanted to go ahead and create a Donkey Kong Country style game, but in 3 dimensions. And they originally called this game Sonic's Ass Game. And basically it's because the way they saw it is that it'd be like Sonic the Hedgehog in a way, except the camera would be behind him, since it would be 3-dimensional. Thus, you'd be looking at his ass. And that was actually a huge problem that they had in development of this game, and I'll get into that a little later. But what was really interesting about that is they were one of the first developers out there to actually think of a character-based platforming game for 3D consoles. Period. And while there are ones that came out beforehand, I think it was like Floating Runner or something was like that. I forget what that game was called, but they're crap. Just absolute crap. This is the first developer, along with Miyamoto with Nintendo, that really sat down and thought about how to make a 3D platformer. And in fact, the whole Sonic's Ass game, Andy goes ahead and he still believes to this day that the reason why the platformer that came out for the Sega Saturn was Knights instead of Sonic was simply because they didn't want to risk messing up a Sonic game, with the fact that it might not work by having the camera behind him, which is ironic to think, because every single third-person game, whether it's a platformer or not, every single third-person game goes ahead and has a camera behind the player. But I guess back then it was a huge, thing to worry about. Do you really want to be looking at the butt of the character the whole entire time? And they actually did a number of things to counter this. That's why Crash 1 through 3, which is the Crash Bandicoots that Naughty Dog made along with CTR and Bash, that's why they always had the boulder level where you're running towards the screen as the Indiana Jones style boulder came racing down in front of you. And that's also why Crash Bandicoot looks at the screen at the beginning of every single level, because they want to make sure that you know who the character is. Now, granted, they also have some classic side-scrolling type levels as well, and that was actually done to further the point that this is a platformer and this is what the character looks like, and to basically utilize a 3D as much as humanly possible. And if you go into that mindset where they were influenced by Donkey Kong Country, you can definitely see it. You have the jungle levels, you have the more industrial levels with the heat vents, and the platforming is nearly identical in many ways. But what was really interesting was the development. So they really wanted to go ahead and give this a very clean look. I'm sure you guys know by now that PlayStation 1 games tend to maybe have some faults. Number one, that's texture warping. And number two, sometimes the resolution isn't so good. They got around by that by using the 512 by 240 resolution instead of the 320 by 240 resolution. Now this ate more VRAM, but the good thing about that though was that it afforded them a cleaner look. Now, since it took more VRAM, that means that it didn't have as much room for textures, but that was actually a good thing, because as you well know, a lot of games that had textures on players and such, they worked like crazy on PlayStation. And so what they did to avoid this and to give Crash Bandicoot a clean look was that he's just shaded. He's kind of like Mario in Super Mario 64. He's just completely shaded, and there's only two textures. One for the spots, not the whole back, just the spots on his back, and one for the shoelaces, which basically are just white stripes on his black shaded shoes, which is very interesting. Anywho, so the other thing that they decided to do was they wanted to get to a 3 to 4 joint weighting on the model, which would also afford them more realistic movement, more bones if they wanted to use that. However, in order to accomplish that, they needed SGI computers, Silicon Graphics International computers. And that's the reason why a lot of early PlayStation games look really blocky. It's like everybody kind of moves like they have a stick up their ass. That's actually no fault of their own. It's just how the PlayStation kits were sent out. And most developers at the time used a $3,000 PC, not a $100,000 SGI computer. So that's just what you're going to get, because they're using the PlayStation's stock library. In fact, this is actually a huge problem that they have with the press, is that by the time they released their first demo reel on VHS, yes, I was just trying to think of what year that was. I think it was 1995. No one believed them. Developers on PlayStation, developers on N64, developers on Sega, no one believed them. People are trash talking them like crazy, blah, 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 blah. Why were they doing this? Because the graphics were so impressive that there was literally nothing out there like that. In fact, there wasn't even anything out there like that probably by 1997, other than another Crash game. What made Crash so amazing was that he was so lively. And the way that they did that was by using the SGI computers to control vertices. Now, you're probably asking what that is. So basically, instead of controlling bones, which would make a very robotic movement, think Mario in Mario 64. Mario is not terribly expressive, obviously. His face doesn't move. The only thing that moves maybe is textures on his eyes and mouth, but everything else is very static. Yes, he moves around, looks around, but the actual polygons on the face, on the body, on the arms, they don't really move. His fist, I think, is bigger, but that's about it. It's not very complex, and it's because that is how they were developing that game. Whereas these guys, the way that they were able to get like on the title screen, how he's like looking to the side, and the way that he's able to like mouth movements, so like he can smile, he can go like this and do everything in between. It's a reason why, you know, he's doing all sorts of fun flippy moves and all that type of stuff, is because they were literally pulling vertices. So what's really cool is that if they wanted him to smile more, they just go and just show the texture there, and then make it small and everything in between. and it made it very much like a Looney Tunes cartoon, which is what they were going after, and no one had ever known that you could do something like that on such weak hardware, relatively, compared to an SGI computer at least. You have to remember that an SGI computer had probably like, what was it, like, I think Naughty Dog had 4 gigs of RAM by 1997 in their SGI machines. I know like 8 gigs of RAM in 1998 cost $75,000. So that's a lot of money. Like, developers just didn't fork over this kind of cash. And they didn't really have a publisher lined up with Universal until much, much later into development. So the computers, all that type of stuff, that was out of their own pocket. The $35,000 PlayStation development unit, everything was out of their own pocket. So their PCs cost $100,000 a piece. Instead of $3,000 for a typical PC, they had a 3 to 5 computer farm that was rendering things. So it would take about 24 hours to render a single level. And that was just to see what it looked like and how it played, and if it was fucked up, then they had to do it all over again. And but anyway, so the way that they're after, they have this complex vertex system, they had to do like 10 times compressors on everything, just make it really, really, really simple so that the PlayStation could read it and display it. Because, the amount of RAM that these SGI computers had compared to a PlayStation was like 80 bajillion times more. I mean, seriously. I think at the time, in 1996, they were working with 512 megs of RAM. The PlayStation has 2. So you really have to compress that down so the PlayStation can run it with a 30 frames per second locked frame rate, which is what Crash Bandicoot does, which is really impressive. And one of the ways they're able to do this was that they had a locked camera system. So the camera went on a rail, which means that at any particular time, they could predict at what certain point what polygons would be visible. So what they did in order to go ahead and hide things is that they would have twists and turns and foliage and that type of stuff. The foliage was really cool. They programmed the foliage so that it was a really low polygon count, but it would block things in the distance. And basically, this allowed them to keep the polygon count down there, and create more complex worlds. So the polygons in the plant would actually be programmed to disappear, and just the texture would be left there. So there was nothing being spent on these plants, and they were blocking your field of view on the polygons ahead, which would keep the polygon count down, which is really smart stuff. Not a lot of developers were doing this at the time. I know today this is pretty commonplace, but at the time this was pretty, revolutionary talk. And they opted to go for this format instead of a free roam, just simply because of that, and making a camera work on a controller that looks like this is pretty hard. In fact, there's a reason why the DualShock came out, but that's another story. Even the C buttons on the N64 make it very hard to control a camera. Look at this Mario 64 again. The camera's horrible. Moving on. So, basically, they went ahead and kept on working on this, kept on working on compressing everything down, kept on working on making everything efficient. And, at the same time, they're getting flack from the industry because no one thought that what they're doing was real. At the same time, you had Miyamoto working on Mario 64, and they had no clue what was going on. Again, this is the days before, like, internet. In E3's 1995 E3, the then president of Atari, in an interview, went ahead and said that they were considering making a World Wide Web page. Considering. Like, you have to understand this is a completely different era that we're talking about here. This isn't something where I have a website and I'm talking to you via YouTube. Like, huge corporations were still mulling around the thought of having a web page. Pretty insane stuff. So, the idea that people were connected back then, well, that kind of falls flat on its face. People just didn't know what people were doing. Unless someone specifically told a publication to put it out in the news, like, to a magazine or a newspaper or whatever, people just didn't know what people were working on, period. They could guess, but that was it. So it wasn't really until Mario 64 released 3 months prior to Crash Bandicoot did they play Mario 64, in which their first reaction actually was relief, because Mario 64 looked very robotic, and while it was open world, it was significantly less detailed than Crash Bandicoot. No one can deny that. And the camera was horrible. So they felt like they were on a good track. They felt like they did. Again, everyone is trying to figure out what a platformer would be like in 3D, and that's how they did it, and that's how they did it. And it's so early that, it's just kind of curious how two different development teams went at very very different paths. And you have to understand why each company did what they did. At the time, these developers obviously hadn't got a huge handle on their hardware yet. And with the N64, those levels were as big as they could be. And the reason why they were less detailed is because the N64 was actually very good at handling big polygons, which PlayStation was not good at. So it could do larger environments, but it didn't have the processing power to go ahead and make anything there that was any sort of detailed environment. I mean, just look at games like Star Fox 64. Everything is very bland, stretched, but the world is big, right? And then you have games like, Descent, which are much more detailed than Star Fox, but they're much smaller. The environments are very small compared to Star Fox, and you're kind of stuck in a confined area. Everyone's playing to their strengths. So while Mario 64 had bigger landscapes, they're very simple looking and very ugly looking and very undetailed, where these guys were confined to a smaller space, and they're confined to maybe having the camera go on a rail so they could better keep track of their performance. But at the same time, graphics were better, animations were better, and it looked more next gen at the end of the day. Whether or not it played like that's up to you to decide. But it's just really interesting hearing them talk about certain things, like the 3 skunks. They couldn't have those 2 times in a row to make it more challenging, because it was just taking up too much hardware power. So that's how they came up with crates. The crates were something that were low polygon count that the player could take care of while the system was preparing itself to come up with more enemies. That's why it doesn't feel like there's a lot of enemies in this game. And actually that's how his name came about, because while they wanted a Bandicoot, they were calling him during development Willy the Wombat. And they didn't really know what to call him until the crates came about in development. And the act of you crashing into the crates, that's how they got the name Crash. They actually had to fight pretty hard to keep that, because Universal didn't want that name, and they literally just put their foot down. I mean, you have to understand, these were a couple 24-year-olds making these games. I mean, these weren't people who were used to being told what to do, and thank God that that's how they acted, because we wouldn't got the Crash Bandicoot that we wanted today. So anywho, moving on. So by the time that this game released, it wasn't until this game was released that people truly understand that there were no lies, and that this game really was that amazing. In fact, this was basically like the Call of Duty of its day, and people don't seem to understand that. There's a reason why there's a greatest hits on here. There's a reason why the PlayStation stayed around. There's a reason why the PlayStation did so well. And it's largely thanks to games like this, and games like Ridge Racer, which was another early hit. Crash Bandicoot really showed developers and gamers that the PlayStation was nothing to laugh at, and you can make a hell of a game with this technology. And by the time that 1996 rolled around, the PlayStation had been lowered in price from $299 to $199. This is a no-brainer, and that's why it kicked Nintendo's butt, really, frankly, between the games and the price, and their better relationship with developers and the cheaper costs that produce games on CD versus cartridges. It was just game over. I still love the N64. In fact, it's one of my favorite systems of all time, so please don't think I'm being biased or anything, but it's just a cold hard fact. In fact, as a Nintendo fan back in the day, I didn't like the PlayStation at first, because it was kicking Nintendo's ass in many ways. It wasn't until later that I got into PlayStation when I played PlayStation on my friend's PlayStation. I think it was 1997, and we played games like Crash Bandicoot and Twisted Metal 2 and Final Fantasy 7, and I just fell in love with it. Anywho, so this game really changed the course of gaming, especially on PlayStation. People understood now that they had to get better computers, that there was different ways to make animations and the like other than using the library set that the PlayStation was given in a development cycle to developers. And there was ways to go about things and making a better game. In fact, even early on, Sony didn't even believe them. Sony actually, when they saw that footage, they came over and they were just in disbelief and they couldn't understand how they were doing it. In fact, Sony tried to make their own game, and it was canceled because they couldn't figure out how to do it. That's Sony's internal studios couldn't make a Crash clone. That is how ahead of its time this game was. Another thing to think about too, Naughty Dog was a really talented developer. They made 3 of these games, Crash Bash, and they also, with some help from another developer in conjunction with Naughty Dog, they went ahead and made CTR. That's 5 games, 3 platformers. The next time that we would see Mario was Sunshine on the GameCube. So the way that they set up their development kits, it was efficient. And the way that they set up everything, it was efficient so they could keep on making more games, use the same type of engine, and improve it along the way. And frankly, these guys were just good programmers and engineers. And Mark Cerny was on the team as well, and he was extremely talented. He was a very good programmer. In fact, he made a lot of the compressors that ran Crash the way it did on the PlayStation. So, huge props to those guys. I know that some of you guys make fun of games like Knack, and rightfully so. But, these guys have contributed so much to this industry, and we wouldn't have games like we do today. And even genres outside of platformers copied how they did things. So, for those people who really like first-person shooters and the like, it was games like this that paved the way. You gotta remember at the time, you had things like Doom. Soon after this, you had games that looked a lot better than Doom. So, pick yourself up a copy of Crash Bandicoot. It's actually starting to go up in value. So, if you're gonna pick it up, now's a better time than ever. PlayStation right now is kind of going through its collectible growing pains, kind of like N64, where it's going from being worthless to being worth something. And that goes for the system and the games. So I wouldn't wait too much longer to start collecting on PlayStation if I were you. And I would definitely start with Crash Bandicoot. And you can go ahead and get a very honest look as to what PlayStation looked like versus its competitors at the same time. And you can also see why Sega Saturn isn't around past 1997 and why Sega isn't around anymore. So anyway, that's a not so bite-sized episode for Crash Bandicoot. I hope I let you guys know some new information about the game. Please check out his blog. It's a really interesting read. It's set aside maybe an hour and you can get through a whole bunch of stuff and you'll learn so much more even than what I told you today. And once again, I shall see you next time. Please comment, rate, and subscribe. And see you next time. Bye.
Bytesized.